Paul, I think you came in as a graduate engineer and you went through being an engineer in studios, OBs, and at the end of your career, you were incredibly senior because you were in charge of things like the Olympics. Tell me how your career started.
Yeah, I mean, strictly speaking, I was never in OBs, but I did a lot of work with OBs and a lot of work internationally. But started, well, I was recruited in what universities used to call the milk round. The BBC was going through a period of rapid expansion with 625 and BBC Two, Colour all having started relatively recently. And I went straight to the Engineering Training Centre in Evesham in Worcestershire, which is a wonderful
Hmm.
place, not only for the training, but also for the kind of social life and the ability to fix your car at the weekend if you stayed up there.
They had a very good bar, if I remember.
They had a very good bar, but they had an even better. And as you know, the BBC has or had clubs all over the place. And
Yes.
in Evesham itself, the training centre was a little out of Evesham in a place called Wood Norton, but there was a great club in Evesham itself, and that was very popular, and had dances there on certain evenings with some of the students from Cheltenham. So yeah, it was an initial training course. It was really conversion because we'd all come in with some kind of electronic capability, but this was really telling us about the specifics of television, which was interesting. It was something really know a lot about, although I'd had an interest in hi-fi. And in those days, unlike today, there was no such thing as kind of home video cameras. You had no experience of stuff like that, so it was a first kind of hands-on experience with TV equipment.
How long was that course, and did you get very much practical experience there? Because they had
Uh,
a studio at Wood Norton.
They do. It was. I mean, in a way, the engineering side of it was not particularly challenging from what I'd been studying at university. This was really about maintenance and kind of lining cameras up and things like that.
Hmm.
Just getting to know the signal chain and a
Yes.
lot of fault finding. It's remarkable how many valve bases had sellotape on them. I can't remember the exact length. About 6 weeks. I think it was a two-part course. We went back I think within the year. But we were all on that half of the course. We were all graduate engineers, and then at the end of that first half of the course, we were all allocated on station, as they say. Some people went into videotape. Some people went into telecine. I went into studios, which I was quite happy with in a way. Usually, the habit was that you were put into a thing called base maintenance, which would have probably ended my career in the BBC before it had started, because you were just given things to mend. But
Yes.
luckily, because of all the new recruits, I ended up in a studio, which was fascinating because it gave me an insight to television production. You know, the first time I listened to talkback and found out how programs are actually made, which was actually the exciting part of it. The less exciting part of it was that my 3 years at university had one day on valves, and I was put into a black and white studio, which was almost entirely valves and cameras, which were built on these pickup tubes called image orthicons, which were
Yes.
a magnificent beast. They were so beautiful that people were given them as retirement presents on a wooden base.
These are the ones with swing lenses.
There was
Nine.
still a mixture of turret cameras, four fixed focal lenses on a turret, but there you could also put a zoom on as well, kind of hang the zoom on. I think there was still this was TC5, Studio 5 at Television
Ah,
Centre. I
well,
think TC2 was still black and white, and I think the studios down in Lime Grove were still black and white.
certainly. Yes. Well, I started at black and white at Lime Grove in '69, and then we did a lot of stuff from TC2 and TC5.
Right,
So probably our careers crossed at that time.
very well. To me, it was just getting to know how television worked and knowing how to fix things that had valves in them and use a valve
Yeah.
tester and things like that.
But
But
you were largely in the apparatus room, were you, at
oh,
that time?
absolutely, yeah. But there was always the opportunity to look around. I mean, Television Centre was always open. You could go and look in other studios. You could sit down and listen to a rehearsal of in concert with some of my favourite. And there was always the BBC Club. I mean, really sociable, and inviting a lady friend on a Wednesday evening when Top of the Pops was recorded was usually a good pull.
Right. So how long did you stay in the apparatus room, as it were, before
Well, I
you
mean, in
moved
that
on?
particular studio, it was a matter of months. We went back to Evesham for part two of the course. The interesting thing there was, in part one, this was just for directory engineers who had come in qualified, whereas they then merged it with the BBC had a thing called the C course, which was the next stage for people who'd come in through the BBC's own training process as a technical assistant. And they merged the two courses, so half of us were graduates, and half had come up through the BBC system. And the sad thing was that we didn't have to pass an exam at the end of it, and the people who'd come up through the BBC system had an exam to pass. So
Right.
we would go down to the club at Evesham in the evening, and the other half would get swatting for the test. But luckily, when I came back from Evesham, was soon allocated to a colour studio, and that was television theatre down in Shepherd's Bush, and that was good because it was colour, but it was also because it was a little kind of island site on its own. You're away from television centre, and so there's a degree of semi-independence, and it was all light entertainment. With producers like Stuart Morris and stars, some of whom can't be named these days, but the likes of the Cliff Richard Show and Lulu and people like that.
So you were still in the apparatus room, were you? Or were you?
I was, but in colour, there was a lot more to do with lining the cameras up in those days. They were still tube cameras initially. And there was an operational role in the lighting control room, and that was colour balancing the 4 or 5 cameras, trying to keep them all looking the right colour. It was kind of called being on the knobs, and
Yes.
the person who'd set up the cameras then worked with the vision crew, the lighting director, to drive these cameras, during the recording or the live production. So. That was a kind of a bit more exposure to at least tech ops as opposed to necessarily production. But in the course of still being in engineering, I got a couple of times. I was sent over to Belfast with a more senior engineer. We'd taken a piece of is now ancient, but was then new character generator because they had some elections over there were important. But it was in the middle of the Troubles, and we stayed in the big hotel, which was, I think, variously known as the Forum or the Europa. A couple of interesting incidents then. There was one morning I'd asked for an early morning call. This is long before you could set your phone to be the alarm. And the phone rang in the morning, and it was reception. And they said, "There's a suspect bomb outside. Please close the curtains and move away from the window." So I closed the curtains and moved away from the window. And a couple of minutes later, the phone rang, and it was reception. They said, "Good morning, this is your early morning call."
No bomb went off.
No, but on another occasion, we were in the BBC canteen restaurant in Broadcasting House in Belfast, and there was a massive boom, and I can still feel the pressure wave on my chest, there's a bomb that's about 300 yards away. And we said, "Well, why didn't you tell us?" And they said, "Well, because it was 300 yards away." That was, and we kind of stayed over the weekend and did a bit of touring around, which was interesting, but a little hairy at times. A bit later on, I was asked to join the production team of a program called the Burke Special with James Burke.
Oh, yes.
Kind of new technology based live. And I was the kind of tame engineer who was there to take in these demos that academics had brought in from around the country and interface it with a studio environment and make sure it worked. And there were 2 or 3 interesting experiences then, one of which there was a program on a computer language. It was kind of a forerunner to Logo, but they had a toy turtle. They called it a turtle. And there was I think a PhD student from MIT, but he was based up in Edinburgh, where they've got a big department of artificial intelligence, or they had then. And we spent the day before rehearsing with this kit. We had two, if you remember, acoustic modems, two phone lines tied up with acoustic modems to Edinburgh, just checking all this kit out and television centre. And then we took it down to television theatre, which is actually where the programme was coming from, only to discover that the power supply in the rack of his equipment had blown up. So I found myself on the telephone to some bigwigs in the Department of Artificial Intelligence in MIT in Boston, while he guided me through the appropriate power lines so we could put an external power supply on. And it worked. And another memory from that program was they were doing, I guess it was a program about security, but they had a polygraph or a similar thing. And during rehearsal, I was the one that got wired up with the monitoring and sat in the chair as though I was James Burke. I think he didn't actually know about it for reasons which became obvious. At the appropriate point in the program, a very attractive, sexy lady wearing a fur coat came up to me, threw off the fur coat, and they measured the reaction on the kit I was wired up to. I never did see the readout of it. I had no idea what the reaction was. But probably the most interesting from that programme was that he did an outside broadcast from Corfe Castle in Dorset. And it was on archaeology. They had all the cameras were kind of up the hill at Corfe Castle, and they had various experiments from universities and things with what was then high-tech equipment. And my function was just to make sure it worked in with the OB. Well, this particular piece, I got a kind of a panic call that there's guys at Boffin from, I can't remember which university, but brain the size of a planet, had a rack of equipment which included, I know, a scintillation counter and I can't remember what else. But it wasn't working, and this guy was just throwing up his hands saying, "We'll have to cancel the item, it's not working, it's not working." So knowing absolutely nothing about the particular gear he was working on, went up and analysed it from first principles, realised that quite a lot of kit didn't have any lights on it, went round the back to find a mangled Christmas tree of mains outlets and mains extenders, some of which were just plugged into their own outlets. So we unplugged it all, started from scratch, and I became the hero of the day for getting that going. And then I spent the rest of the show, they were short of someone. I think I sat under one of these large OB zoom lenses holding the cue cards for James Burke for the programme. The day before had been interesting because, as you know, James talked down a lot of the American space shots, and that there was one, I think it was post-Apollo, there was one space shot due to land the day before. And he was the voice of the space program as far as we were concerned. So he was sat in a field with a chroma key screen behind him, and they piped the pictures down from NASA, and he talked it down in the middle of a field in Corfe Castle. So that was the kind of the highlights of the studio engineering. But then as you know, the BBC has got, or certainly had, a great attachment scheme where you could apply for any job you fancied. I applied for and was successful in an attachment as a technical instructor, but in the production training department, which was down in Woodstock Grove, run by a guy who I'm still in touch with called John Simons, and he's one of the people in my BBC career to whom I owe quite a lot. The thing about Woodstock was it was a small training studio, but you could do any job you liked. You could vision mix it, you could light it, you could be on the cameras, and it was great just sitting in on the training programs. That actually gave me in a way not only a background but a leg up to my next move, which was to get on a BBC lighting training course back at Wood Norton. It was probably the best course I ever did at Wood Norton. There's a great bunch of people on it. Having got the lighting training under my belt, I was then able to apply to move over to what was called Tech Ops, Technical Operations, as a technical manager.
The little studio at Woodstock Grove, I seem to remember, was used for a lot of training people from other countries. Was that how you remember it?
Yeah, well, it was both. It was domestic, and there was a lot of overseas. I'm not sure the BBC was, in its wisdom, carried on that overseas training, or in fact, very much external training. But I was very lucky when I was there because they were running a course for Voice of Kenya in Nairobi, and someone who was due to go on it had to drop out. So as a very junior member of the department, I got the trip to Kenya for 6 weeks, which was absolutely fascinating.
With very primitive equipment, or what did they have there?
No, it was a mixture. Perfect. I mean, perfectly usable. I'm fairly sure it was black and white. But I mean, the only time I ever got to touch a 2-inch VTR before that trip was my Evesham course, and that was very introductory. I never had to operate one until the VT engineer in Nairobi didn't turn up. So I was sent down to wind up the VT machine. I got pictures out of it. I'm not saying they were perfect, but it was good. We got privileged treatment from the government, and we managed to go to a couple of the safari parks.
Now, if I remember rightly, if you had a studio recording at Television Centre, you had a resources coordinator, a lighting director, but there was also somebody in the apparatus room looking after things, and there was also a sound supervisor, and they were called TM1, TM2, that sort of thing.
Well, I was the TM2. In those days, lighting kind of ran the management of tech ops. And in current terms, the TM1 would be called a lighting director. And the TM2 booked and ran the technical facilities of the studio, made sure the recording happened or that sources were lined up, recordings were lined up, etc. But was also, depending on the show, the assistant to the lighting director. And if you had a good lighting director and he trusted you, he'd probably give you a set to light. So I got to light the odd Grange Hill and things like that. Later on in my career in tech ops, they changed that. They split it to be lighting directors and technical coordinators, and so that you didn't actually need the lighting qualification to get the TM2 role. And in fact, all of the TM2s were hauled up to the boss's office and told whether they were able to go on to be a lighting director or not. I was told if I wanted, I could do it, but in the same breath, the head of lighting pointed that he knew I'd already applied for my next role, which is technically coordinating major operations out of studio. So rather expecting me to go that way, which is what I did. I got that job and moved on to become the senior studio operations technical coordinator. There weren't any technical coordinators, but I was the senior one.
Tell me a little bit, before you move on, about lighting, because I remember that the lighting rigs at Television Centre were remarkably sophisticated, and you could light something remarkably well and have the lighting settings recorded on a sort of computer thing. Is that right?
That's right. I mean, the studios at Television Centre had what's known as a saturation rig, and all the studios were slightly different, but typically you'd have 2 luminaires on a bar on a pantograph, which would go up and down, and one end of the luminaire was a hard source, a spotlight if you will, and the other end was a soft source with an egg crate, although you really needed to put more than one of them together to make it soft. And one thing, and I think the thing that probably scared us most on that lighting course at Evesham was that you weren't actually allowed to touch these lights yourself. An electrician with a long pole had to do that under your instructions, so you'd go down and possibly sit where the presenter was going to be and direct the electrician to point the lamp and adjust the barn doors and things. And you had a team up in the lighting gallery of a vision operator who would, it's what OBs call racks, would adjust the black level and the exposure on the camera, and a vision supervisor who operated the lighting board that you referred to. And you work together as a 3-man team. As a TM2, the kind of biggest show you tended to get was something like Blue Peter, which was always a challenge because it was live, and in those days it was, even though it was in colour, it just had a white cyc. Later on, it became, they used gels and things. But Biddy Baxter, who was the formidable editor, was absolutely on it if the cyclorama wasn't perfectly evenly lit in perfect white. I don't think she was too bothered if the presenters were silhouettes, just as long as the cyc was peak white. And it was things like Play School and Jack and Orin.
I'm very aware these days that you often see a lot of lighting that's very flat, Whereas in those days, you basically had, even if you had people moving around in the studio, you would try and keep a backlight and a fill and a key light for basically any position that the presenter or guest was in. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think because it's multi-camera, I think it was always actually more challenging than the kind of single camera work that went on at film studios, even though
Yes.
they, I think, regarded themselves as slightly the elite. And you were at the same time often working around a sound boom, so there was always a discussion as to whose fault the boom shadow was. It was
Boom shadow,
inevitably the
yes.
lighting director's fault, but there was an interesting compromise to be had there. But I mean, the lights in those days were in the days of the 4-tube color cameras. They were 5K luminaires switchable to 2.5. So that's 5 kilowatt, 2.5 kilowatt per luminaire, and you could get to hundreds of amps in the studio.
Yes.
So massive power. I mean, television centre, as you probably know, could take in its heyday 5 megawatts of power
Good grief.
for the lighting power and the air conditioning and all the tech kit.
And that's because the cameras were not that sensitive, so you needed a lot of light. And it was presumably also tungsten lighting, so very hot.
That's absolutely right. It was tungsten light. I'm not sure how much LEDs they would install now, but I'm sure LEDs is the way to go. And the 4-tube cameras were good, the ME 2001s, but we lit at 1600 lux, which took quite a lot of light.
Yeah.
When the newer 3-tube cameras came in, they halved the lighting power. They were more sensitive. But I remember in the transition, I was lighting a Delia Smith program, and I'd seen a lot of photography books of kind of really cracking food photography with lots of depth of field. So I thought, well, we'll stay lighting to the higher level and stop the lens down, which I did, and it worked. But they were a little bit puzzled as I'm not sure the air conditioning could handle it anymore, because the kind of pastry wouldn't set.
Yeah, I remember you had an air conditioning unit that had to be switched off for the recording because it was noisy.
Well, some of the studios were a bit rumbly. But I think there was also, you couldn't let people get too hot. But yeah, the rumble from the air conditioning was often a problem.
So equipment was getting more sensitive, and you were also moving up in the hierarchy. What period are we talking about now? Is this the 80s?
Well, I moved on from being a TM in about 83. As a TM, I tended to specialise in technically complex shows. I mean, news and current affairs, and sport, and did quite a lot of things like children in need. In fact, when you were a new TM, they threw you in the deep end by giving you a few weeks on Nationwide, if you remember that. A technically almost impossible program because it was all seat of the pants, last minute stuff. But you had to keep your wits around you on that. We had more than one hairy moment on it.
Give us an example.
Well, I think in my second week there, the BBC communication system, which carried talkback and communication to cameras and nations and regions, everyone, some would switch, some would open. We used to go upstairs for a meeting with the network engineers about which regions were coming into the show. And just before I went up, the whole of the comm system lit up orange and then went off. And the studio engineer said, it's okay, it's probably a power supply, we'll fix it before you back down. Came down from the planning meeting, and it was apparently working for a short while, and then it did it again. And it did it twice more. They'd blown out the power supply for Studio E, borrowed the spare power supply, which had blown, and then they'd borrowed the power supply from Studio D, which they also blew. So there was no comm system, and I'm forever grateful to a sound supervisor called Malcolm Johnson, who took a Sony ECM50 mic, wrapped it around the talkback mic, and just plugged the output of that everywhere. So cameras, regions, network, everybody got open talkback, and we did a complete nationwide with that jury rig.
Yeah.
But interestingly, I say I did a lot of children in need. I think the first one came out of Press B, but thereafter I did quite a lot from the studios, TMing them and then getting across them later on. But the early ones, I think latterly it's become more of an LE show, but early on it was run by Current Affairs, the same people that ran Nationwide, edited by Mark Patterson and directed by Peter Morpurgo, who was totally cool, excellent director. But even if they started with this script, they tore it up after the first item and just they much preferred to do it by the seat of the pants. The other thing was that all of the regions, that was their big night of the year, and the last people they really wanted to talk to was London. So I mean, a couple of hairy moments on that. I'd set one up. It was all working. All the nations and regions, all the cons were working. There was an important sports meeting that I had to go to down in Kensington House, as it was then, only for about an hour or so. And there was a fairly heavy rainstorm. And when I got back, all of the circuits which had been set up, all of the comm circuits had disappeared because the ducts had flooded. So that was an interesting Children in Need. But you could never get a perfect Children in Need. It was just one of those things. But we did pretty well. And the crew would come around with a bucket, and everybody would put some paper money into it as their contribution. And then I'd come back and find that the family had been contributing on the credit card as well. So I'm not sure I ever earned anything on that show. Oh, it was very worthwhile. No, all was great fun.
So what about, you say you didn't work on OBs, but towards the end of your career, I mean, you were doing nothing but things
that's
like
right.
the Olympics and so on.
Yeah, I mean, by that I meant I was never on the staff of Kendall Avenue, although I did an informal attachment there. Yeah, I mean, because I did a lot of sport when I was a TM, and then in the later role. In 1980, the Olympics were in Moscow, and about 3 weeks before the games, I got a call from a colleague, John Carter, who was the kind of main technical manager for sport at the time, and he was running the Moscow operation, and I think I was on leave. I think it was possibly just the end of my marriage leave, but anyway, John said, how would you like to go to Moscow? So I said, great. I came back the next week, and we're having a drink in the club, as you did in those days, and started asking John, what are we going to be doing in Moscow? And he said, oh, it's not we, I'm not going anymore, it's just you.
Good
so the operation had been planned, and the technical operation was being planned by a guy called Norman Taylor, no longer with us. But no, that was an amazing trip. I remember kind of going through the airport, Sheremetyevo, I think, and going through the accreditation process where you get checked out, and then you get an accreditation hung around your neck. And this guy, who I didn't expect a word of English, just did it all, hung the accreditation around my neck and stood up, shook my hand and congratulated me. And then I was into Moscow and into the Cosmos Hotel, and I wondered, what on earth have I let myself in for? Because, of course, it was very much behind the Iron Curtain in those days. But I kind of thought, well, let's go and have an explore, and quickly found the bar. And found some familiar faces, an EM from Belfast called George Campbell, who'd been on the lighting course at Evesham, and various others, and kind of broke the ice. And it was, if you remember, Mrs. Thatcher didn't want the BBC to go. So the BBC, being the BBC, kind of halved the staff but didn't halve the programming. So it was fairly long hours. We're in there for about 8 in the morning. We'd walk in from the hotel past the Space Museum, and at about 10:30 in the evening, we then had a piece into the current affairs program. I think it was probably Tonight in those days rather than Newsnight, but whenever it was. So we'd get back the hotel for sometime after midnight, and the service for dinner, because we hadn't eaten by that point, was incredibly slow. So not much sleep was had before the next day. But I think it's always been true of the Olympics, because it's only 2 or 3 weeks. You can take it. You can take the pace for a few weeks, and then you just have to collapse. The linking studio for that one was in London, but what we were doing was largely live. There was a videotape operation, which was very unusual because that was on the floor above, whereas it was always in the basement at Television Centre. No, we were very much live, contributing into the linking studio in London.
Using equipment that you'd taken with you,
No,
or did you have to use Moscow's?
It was largely supplied by the Russians. We were working in CCAM, whereas of course the UK's in PAL. It wasn't
Yes.
PAL at that time.
CCAM's the French system, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. So, yeah, it was all interesting. We got away with it.
There were presumably Russian operators.
Yeah, that's right.
Camera
There are
operators and so on.
enough of them. We took some of our own camera crews, but the studio engineers were Russian, but they did speak enough English. But they'd only had fairly basic training, and their vision operation was very basic. They'd obviously been told to keep the electronic signal under 1 volt, and that they did, even though the monitor looked black. It was difficult getting them to expose the cameras correctly, but they were really friendly. That was the first Olympics. I didn't plan that one, but I worked on every Olympics from then on for the BBC until 2008, and then at the end of my career for the host broadcast for 2012. And in fact, even continued on. I did a job in 2014, so I never actually counted up the number of Olympics I've worked on, and that's Summer Games and Winter Games. As I was saying, most Olympics we work long hours, but I don't think I've worked anything like as long as that one, just because of the political situation. The upside of the political situation was that NBC pulled out, and I got a proper hotel bed instead of being in the media village, which was apparently the original plan. I mean, that was the exec producer on that was a guy called Alec Weeks, the late Alec Weeks, but he had originally, his great claim to fame was one of them. He'd been a boxer, but he directed the 1966 World Cup final.
Oh.
And the producer there, well, there were two of them, Martin Hopkins and Jim Reside, who are two more people who I owe a lot to from BBC Sport.
Yeah. So that was 1980 something.
That was 1980. That
Right.
was, I was still at TM2 at the time, but
Right.
doing quite a lot of sport, a lot of grandstands and things like that.
Yeah. Comms in those days. How was the picture getting back? By satellite?
In those days, internationally, it was almost certainly satellite. I mean, relatively close things would be microwave links, but one of the things about that job that Norman Taylor did that I inherited later on when I effectively took on that part of the role was that you had to work out who was going to get the next Olympics and book a satellite, because they were rare as hen's teeth, and often we were up against ITV and other countries who wanted the same things. And you could book a satellite, and it was very easy to get to the point where if you didn't cancel it, it would cost a real load of money. And I remember when I took on that job, that someone had wrongly guessed where I think it was a World Cup was going to come from, and booked a satellite out of Colombia, which was never needed. Luckily, somebody spotted, and it was cancelled. But yeah, I mean, latterly it is very much fibre, but I was very much across that transition, and also going from very much analog in those days to digital now.
They were heroic days, weren't they? That period, engineering was quite challenging.
Yeah, I think things that are very simple these days and are taken for granted were a challenge. I mean, when I was again still a TM, some of the recorded shows I did were clever electronic effects shows, and some of them were shows that you just think nothing of. You probably do it on your PC at home now, but some of the things were very complex. At the last minute, I was asked to get involved in a show called The Diary of Bridget Hitler, which was a thing directed by Philip Saville, and I think written by Beryl Bainbridge. but they wanted to use some what should be straightforward chroma key, color separation overlay, but they wanted to lay down the background afterwards, which in the analog days was very difficult. But there was a video effects guy called Mitch Mitchell who kind of became the doyen of video effects and moved to the commercial sector. And he said he outlined this plan whereby we had a third videotape machine, time code locked, and we recorded a separate key that could be played back in later on and used as a key. And he said, "Don't worry about it. They do it all the time in the outside world." So I went ahead, set it all up with some studio engineers and some videotape engineers, and we made it all work a treat. It was only afterwards he told me completely made the thing up. Nobody ever done it before. And I also remember getting involved in a thing called the Light Princess, which was a kind of mixture of cartoon backgrounds and live foregrounds, which was all chroma key. And one of the oddities about BBC planning was that they assumed that the technically complex shows were going to be in the small studios. So TC2 and TC5, etc., were kitted out with lots of outside source lines and lots of technical kit.
Yeah.
But the big studios were the sitcom type studios and dramas that didn't need a lot of technically complex kit, which worked on most occasions until they wanted to do something like a general election or something really complex. So they had to import a load of extra boxes and strap them all together. So it looked a bit of a mess, but worked.
But I seem to remember with general elections that you would tend to have two studios. You would use TC5 or something like that, as well as TC1. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I did about 6 months after getting the senior technical coordinator job. I inherited the 1983 general election, which had been basically planned by my predecessor, but I was just kind of handed over a set of ideas, and I had about 6 months to make it work, which was interesting.
General election must have been extraordinarily complicated. You've got OB sources coming from virtually everywhere.
Yeah, I mean that kind of program in those days, along with things like Children in Need, was done on a kind of hub basis. So there'd be a regional hub, and the various sub-sources would be switched in there, and it was a case of making sure that the region had switched to the right source that you wanted, but you couldn't necessarily see the next source you were coming to until the region switched it.
And you had to have, I mean, there were problems of gen locking, and so the pictures wouldn't roll. How was that? How was that organised?
Yeah, I mean, it was a kind of daily thing on Nationwide that the BBC had invented a thing called NatLock, which is National Slave Lock, and the London studio, which was usually Studio E at Lime Grove, sent out signals to drive in the pulse generators of the remote studios, but that could take quite a long time, and you'd very often go on the air with seeing that the Manchester studio, which was going to be in the opening sequence, still running through out of sync. It usually got there.
In those days, engineering was being developed. Really, broadcasting technology a lot of it was developed by BBC R&D, and also you had designs groups, didn't you?
I can't remember when they came together, but research department used to be based in this wonderful building and grounds called Kingswood Warren, and
yes.
it was a real kind of place for the Boffins. So incredibly smart people down there. And
did you come across them? I mean, did they come and sort of problem solve or try out new kit with you?
No, absolutely. And on things like Olympics, I mean, I think there's probably a belief that it's all cutting edge, but actually the first thing technically about something as complex as an Olympics is that it can't drop off the air.
Yes.
So what the technology you use has to be absolutely reliable and belt and braces. So any new technology has to be on the margins. It has to be an extra, which you can drop if need be. But there was one interesting case later on in my Olympics career, which was the Athens Olympics, which would have been 2004. The BBC had an experimental HD channel, if you remember,
Yes.
which took a kind of mixture of programs from around, and every program had to be largely HD. And when we were planning the Athens Olympics, I think I've got the right one. The host was offering HD from some of the venues, which meant that we had to book high definition capable circuits from the venue into our broadcast centre, because the thing about Olympics is that we spend about 2 years planning and setting up a broadcast centre in the host country, sometimes with a studio there, and the whole program came from the location. Sometimes it was a contribution to a studio in London. But Athens, it was all out there, and because we had the experimental HD channel, I'd gone ahead and booked, with a deadline of something like March, HD video circuits for the venues where we could get HD. And it had to be fairly early booking, but shortly before the booking deadline, the lawyers said, sorry, you can't book HD. There is no government license for the HD channel at the time the Olympics are going out. And everybody knew that, of course, we would be doing it in HD, but we weren't allowed to place bookings for these Olympic circuits. And
Which government was causing a problem? Was it?
Well, no, the UK is in the UK.
Oh, the UK.
The BBC didn't have a license for an HD channel. It was just experimental, and
yes.
the longer term HD broadcast hadn't come in. So of course we did. There was an HD channel for the Olympics, but we didn't have any HD circuits in from several venues because they weren't available. And research department came to our rescue, because they designed a very clever codec, which basically was a black box that took in high definition, sent it out over a standard definition circuit, and brought it back as high definition at the other end. And I took one of these out to a planning meeting, proved that it worked, and we took several of them out and actually used them on the games. It was very successful.
And this was live conversion, was it?
Yeah, well, it was a codec, yeah, in real time.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
But in those days, I suppose a lot of development did come from the BBC, but now it's really not the case. Is that right?
I would say that's true. I mean, obviously, I've been out of it for a few years, but even when I left to go to OBS, the finance wasn't there, and I think the likes of Sky did have the finance. It was interesting that later on, when I ran the technical side of the host broadcaster for the Manchester Commonwealth Games in 2002, and we went to a boxing venue that Sky would use regularly, it became very clear to me that they didn't do it on the cheap. They protected their investment, and they would always have two separate links out, whereas it was always very difficult with the BBC in those days for financial reasons to persuade them that it was worth buying the belt and the braces. Yeah.
Now, if we go back to 1990, about that time, we got Producer Choice coming in.
1990, you say? Yeah. 1990 to me was the World Cup in Rome.
Right, okay. But Producer Choice was introduced in the 90s, wasn't it? I seem to remember. And it must have altered the way the BBC was operating because of Producer Choice. How did it affect you?
Initially, I think even though I was part of what was probably by then Resources.
Yeah.
I mean, it was always Studios, but Studios became part of the wholly owned subsidiary called Resources. But I was by then even though I was part of resources, I was effectively booked at 100% to BBC Sport. So
Yeah.
there wasn't at the time a huge difference to me.
Right. Okay.
Of course,
So
being married to a producer, I had a brass plaque made for the door saying "Producer choice stops here."
the buck hesitates here, I think. Yes, quite. Right. So towards the end of of your career, I mean, you were still doing big Olympic events. China was one, presumably Beijing, and then the UK Olympics, presumably more recently.
Well, Beijing was the last games that I did for the BBC. From when I did Moscow in 1980 and the winters in Sarajevo in '84, someone else had planned them. That was Norman Taylor. But from '86, I took on the role of planning all of these major overseas sports events for sport. So from then on, every summer and winter Olympics, from '88 onwards until 2008, 3 World Cups in 1990, 94, 98, and several Commonwealth Games, were all down to me to plan and resource and deliver.
Yeah.
2008, I'd been involved actually. I think was it 2005 that the announcement that London had got the games. I'd been asked by Dave Gordon, who was head of major events, and another one I owe a lot to in my BBC career. He'd asked me to be on a small group who were advising the organising committee, the forerunners of LOCOG, on the London Games. So numerous meetings with them, and then I was on the panel when the IOC came around to do the investigations. Luckily, they gave us a good report. I don't think we actually won it for the technical expertise, but we could have certainly lost it if we'd messed it up. But in fact, Beijing Games in 2008 was the last one I did for the BBC because I was headhunted in effect by a guy called Manolo Romero, who ran the IOC's host broadcast, so that OBS, Olympic Broadcasting Services. They're based in Madrid, which is where Manolo was based. It's their function to produce the host coverage for all Olympics. It had started a few years before that, but for the Winter Games in Vancouver in 2010, they set up a subsidiary in Vancouver, and they had staff over there, and I was recruited by Manolo to set up Olympic Broadcasting Services London, OBS London. So I left the BBC at the end of 2008, and
right.
It was a fascinating experience because it was just me and I've had to find an office, had to find staff. These are all the things that are a given in the BBC.
Yes.
And you've got departments for this and departments to recruit and personnel and all sorts of things. And I did bring in a few people that I'd work with at the BBC, but and we were quite small. We were only kind of 4 or 5. At the beginning, but we gradually expanded and moved into offices in the same building as Ofcom. They rented a floor in their building overlooking the Thames at Southwark, which was great. I used to think I worked in London when I was in White City, but I actually worked in London when I was looking out the window at St Paul's and Southwark Bridge and the rest of it. So.
Yeah.
But yeah, I spent 4 years travelling backwards and forwards to Madrid and gradually building up the staff. And there's a huge ramp up at the end of Olympic Games as people, short-term staff, come on board. And then we oversaw the building of the broadcast centre in in the Olympic Park, which is now being used by BT Sport,
Yeah.
amongst others, and had to ensure fibre was laid in the ducts in the Olympic Park, and
Yeah.
it was quite an experience.
Yeah. Now let's just go back a bit because what you're saying, I think, is in the early days, when you were doing Olympics in the 80s, the BBC had its own Olympic coverage, but ITV presumably had its coverage.
No, there was
Or did you
always
share resources?
there was always a host broadcaster function, and in the early days it was small enough that probably the state broadcaster, or one of the big broadcasters in the country, provided the coverage and then distributed it to rights holding broadcasters who would add on their own unilateral coverage. But gradually the games got so big that it was almost impossible for any one broadcasting organisation to do that.
Yeah.
And eventually the IOC for the Olympics set up OBS.
I see.
And FIFA for the football employed a company called HBS, Host Broadcasting Services, to do the same sort of thing for the World Cup. I mean, the World Cup it is quite different. The Olympics is majorly in one city, but you can have 30 different sources coming at you at any one time, whereas a World Cup is more about logistics, because for instance in '94 in the States it was coast to coast, but there are never more than 2 matches on at a time. So
no, but different locations.
Different kind of logistical problems.
Yeah. What about dealing with Chinese when you did the Beijing Olympics?
Absolutely fascinating. I enjoyed the trips. I mean, one of the privileges, I guess, of being part of the planning team is that you do have a little time to see the country and meet the people. When you're out there to do the games, it's a case of how long can you stay awake. But
yes, quite.
I was going to actually go out. Was going to have a holiday in China after the Beijing Games, but for various personal reasons that proved not to be the case. So after the London Games in 2012 were over, Kristen and I went out and we had a really good holiday travelling around China, and I just found it very friendly and fascinating, although a little spooky at times when you'd see the big limos with the blacked out windows going by. And of course the internet was all behind the Great Firewall of China.
Yes, indeed. So, how were you getting things back from China? Was this coming again as before by satellite, or was some of it internet?
By then, we'd started to use fibre as well. I think that the Commonwealth Games out of Melbourne, I know we had fibre, and of course you have to excuse me, you have to make sure it goes in diverse routes, and we still had satellite. I don't think I did a games that was totally fibre without a satellite backup. It's a real comfort to know that if you've got a satellite dish outside the broadcast centre and a one back home at your broadcast centre, that there's nothing more than a 23,000-mile return journey through the air that's going to go wrong.
But now you've got things like 4K. So, I mean, the technical demands are enormous, aren't they?
Yeah, the bandwidth requirements go up. And, of course, even Beijing, we were using surround sound. But in the London Olympics, there was an operation, if you recall, that NHK Japan for a long time at IBCs in Amsterdam were demonstrating what was effectively 8K. They called it high vision. And the NHK and the BBC, in conjunction with OBS, did some demos of 8K of high vision for the London Olympics. The opening ceremony was covered in parallel in high vision. So in a way, 4K is a step backwards from that.
Yes.
Yeah.
You were always aware, though, that NHK had much more money to spend on research and development than we did.
Oh, absolutely, I think personally, I think 4K really came about because the receiver industry had had a flop with 3D.
Yes.
Even though we did some 3D for the London Games, and in the right viewing environment, it was really good. But in my view, until you've got 3D without needing to wear specs, it's not really going
Indeed.
to take off.
Well, the future of television and always will be, I think, is what they used to say about 3D.
Yeah.
Sports directors, of course, were always very much on the ball, weren't they? I mean, they had to do their own vision mixing, I think. But you must have seen or, you know, listened to a whole range of directors. Did they vary very much in their competence, their ability?
Sport tended not to suffer fools badly, so any that were incompetent
Didn't last long.
lasted a lot less time than a certain Mr. Hancock. But in terms of sports directors doing their own mixing, yes, on OBs that was often the case when it was really fast switching, like something like a Grand Prix. That there probably wasn't time to give a command to a vision mixer. But in the studios, they tended to have a vision mixer. And in terms, I think I was quite lucky when I was a studio engineer on just listening to talkback of Grandstand. It was still very much in the kind of macho.
Yeah.
But by the time I'd moved up to be a TM and was accepted by Sport, they were still incredibly efficient. But I think they'd learned that if you shouted all of the time, people became immune to it. So it was much more effective that when you really meant something, you raised your voice and banged your fist at that point, and people really took notice. So I think there was a change.
But there's been a huge increase in complexity of coverage of sporting events with action replays, with virtual reality replays and things like that, and also a lot of DVE work, which makes the whole thing very complicated.
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of it's pre-programmed, and I'm sure it's moved on since I was actively involved. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned virtual reality. The problem with that is that it almost inevitably introduced a delay in the vision system that you had to match with the audio, and that virtual setup in TC5.
Yes.
The audio delay was a bit of a nightmare.
Yeah.
But we did at the Olympics in 2000 in Sydney. We had a semi-virtual setup. The broadcast centre was about 20 kilometres from Sydney Harbour, but Sydney Harbour was obviously the iconic shot with the bridge and the Opera House, etc. So we had a green box studio in the broadcast centre, and we brought back, I think it was 3 cameras that were on the shore in Sydney Harbour, robotic cameras, remote controlled from the studio. And there were the 3 levels. There was the real foreground, and then there were some pre-rendered graphic midgrounds, and then there were the pictures from the harbour as the background, and remarkably it worked.
So you could have a moving camera in your box, in your green box, and the exterior cameras would move synchronously. Is that right? Is that how it works?
Absolutely, yeah.
Very clever. Well, one watches a lot of sport coverage these days, and you assume that most of the sets are virtual. Yes. Right. I think we've kind of covered your career because you left the BBC to do the work with the IOC. But looking back, What's your general impression of how the BBC's weathered the recent storms?
I think as I went through my career and as kind of senior managers left and people left, they all said, oh, well, sorry to be going, but I think I've seen the best of the BBC. And it's very easy to think that. I mean, I feel privileged to have worked in all of the countries that I have done and with all the people that I had done. And it was very much, I didn't do these things myself. It was very much pulling a team together. As someone looking in from the outside now, I'm not terribly confident about the future of the BBC. I mean, I'd like to think that I've never worked for it. I'd still be proud of the BBC. Everywhere I went abroad, they'd say, what on earth are you doing? It's crazy. The BBC's got the reputation as a broadcaster throughout the world, and yet you seem to be destroying it at home. And I think it's partly political reasons. I mean, I read Nick Robinson's book, Politicians, and going all the way back, Churchill onwards, and the kind of relationship between the politicians and the BBC. But there's usually someone on their side. But recently, they have been subject to huge budget cuts. There's political pressure and commercial pressure. Pressure to do away with the license fee, and I kind of understand that, but my belief is that if they went to some kind of subscription, by the time people had realised what they hadn't got, it would be too late. The BBC would have gone under.
Yes.
And as you alluded earlier, the BBC really lost its technical leadership purely because it didn't have the money and it had to cut its cloth. And in sport in particular, as you know, sports rights went through the roof with the likes of Sky and BT Sport. So, the BBC has nothing like the portfolio it had. There are still the protected events. And when you look at some of these events, it's only kind of finals. And if there are parts of the events that the BBC can't show, I think they're obliged to offer them elsewhere.
Yeah. Paul, your career's been full of problem solving. Can you give us an idea of one of the hairiest moments?
The European Football Championships, I ran the BBC Broadcast Centre operation in 2000. It was in Amsterdam in one of the halls that they use for the IBC, the broadcast exhibition in Rye. The Euros are going on at the moment, but there was one horrendous evening where there was a major power outage in that part of Amsterdam, and whilst the broadcast centre had reserve generator power for the technical equipment, it couldn't handle all of the air conditioning, and the temperature in the technical kit was going up and up and up. And at the same time, Television Centre had a power failure, and they ran up the standby generators and they failed, and the batteries were running down. We knew that there was a standby in Pebble Mill at the time for the network. Yes. The football coverage, I can't remember which venue it was, but it's a live England game, had a satellite uplink, and we arranged for the pictures to get direct from the ground to Pebble Mill. We never actually lost the broadcast centre. Some of the engineers took the tiles out of the roof and kept the temperature down, but that was one of the more hairy moments.
Yes.
Been a few others, but.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. It's been a great pleasure talking.